What's happening, model makers? I hope everything is going swell this summer in your workshops. I've been on a little bit of a hiatus for making videos, but unfortunately for you guys, I am setting aside all my pathetic excuses about it being hot in my workshop and having no camera mojo and blah, 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 and getting back on the horse. A couple of days ago, I did a video finishing one of my projects, and I threatened to very soon do a video about chipping. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because it seems like my life for the last 3 months has been dominated by chipping. My Accurate Miniatures B25 Mitchell project involved a ton of chipping on the upper wing surfaces. My Mini Art Cat D7 project, lots and lots of chipping. And the project I just finished, which is my ridiculous kit bashing thing between the Revell 132nd Spitfire and the AEC Matador gun truck by AFV Club, also tons and tons of chipping. So it's just been on my mind. I've also been reading a lot. I've been working on getting a review done of Mike Rinaldi's tank art book. He's the chipping master. So anyway, it's just a subject that's been on my mind a lot. And so I have been wanting to do a video about it, which I'll get to the specifics of in a second. The first thing I want to say, though, is that I don't consider myself an expert on chipping. The fact is that this process is alchemy, and you are unlikely to see any two people do it exactly the same way, even if they appear to get the same results. And to kind of illustrate why, I've been thinking about an example from my motocross days. If you look at this picture right here, you'll see this guy trying to walk the fast line around this flat turn. Now, to the casual observer, what I was doing there probably didn't look a whole lot different from what a bunch of other guys were doing. But how fast I got around that corner was dependent upon a bunch of variables that aren't necessarily obvious. Things like the angle of my upper body relative to the center of gravity of the motorcycle. Things like the position of my outside elbow. The angle of my left leg relative to the foot peg, and the amount of pressure that I'm applying to that foot peg. Those are all variables that I can control. There are also some variables that I can't control. Things like how tacky the dirt is, how much friction I get between my tire and the dirt surface. Those are all things that I can talk about all day long. I can show videos, I can illustrate in books, but until you actually are there yourself doing it, it's almost impossible to truly understand the way that all those variables interact. And the result is that one guy gets around that corner 1 second faster than another guy. And that may not seem like a whole lot of difference, but if you've got a racetrack with 10 corners and the race is 10 laps long, by the time the checkered flag drops, you've got 100 seconds difference, and that's quite a bit. And chipping is exactly the same way in my mind. There are a bunch of variables, and although this video is going to be a test of a couple of different chipping fluids, I'm also going to use it as an opportunity to try and communicate what I've learned about the process itself and to talk about those variables. So we're going to get into all of that here in just a few minutes, but let me tell you what basically the test is going to involve. What I wanted to do was just do a kind of a comparison between different chipping fluids, because as you know, you can buy ready-made chipping fluids, or you can use hairspray, which was kind of the original thing. So I've got here the Tresemme number 3 hairspray that Rinaldi recommends a lot in his book. The other one that I got kind of by mistake, and that he kind of specifically says not to use, is this number 4. What he really says is not to use extra hold. Not really sure what the chemistry issue is there, but anyway, I had gotten this by mistake, and so we're going to just compare it. Also, I have here some MIG heavy chipping fluid and some MIG scratches effects. So, what I'm going to do is I have a section of trusty Spitfire wing here that I'm going to divide up into 4 parts. I've painted it white, and then I'm going to come back over that with something that'll be high contrast, probably some flat black or flat red or something, so that the chips will show real easily. And then we're going to go over to the spray booth. I'm going to spray the chipping fluid, then spray the paint, and then we're going to get right into the actual chipping process. So, again, I do not consider myself an expert on the subject of chipping, and I don't know that I ever will be. If you want the expert, you've got to go find a guy like Mike Rinaldi. But I have learned a tremendous amount, and I feel like I can pass some of those things on. And I have gotten to a point where I at least feel like my chipping process is predictable and controllable, and I have, an 80 or 90% chance of getting the effect that I want, because I've finally figured out the interaction of all of those variables that I was talking about within my own workflow. So, let's get into it. Let's go spray some chipping fluid. Okay, hopefully you guys will be able to hear me over the noise of my ventilator. I've got a new spray booth, and it's a little bit loud, but it also has lights. So the first thing that I'm going to do is apply the heavy chipping effects. I just chose that randomly to start out with. And I'm going to apply it with my airbrush, obviously, because it's in a bottle. And so that dictates how I'm going to apply everything, including the hairspray, because I want that to be one of the controls. And that's something that I should talk about right up front, because how you apply the material is one of the first variables that's going to come into play. Now, Rinaldi is a big fan of just spraying it, hairspray, which is his preferred chipping fluid, directly out of the can. And his prescribed method is 2 light passes at arm's length. Now, I've tried it. I can't control it. I always get way too much. And so I went to using the airbrush, and that's worked really well for me. So when we get to that, I've got hairspray that's been decanted into a bottle, and that's how I'll be applying that. So let's just get started. I'm going to be spraying this at a pretty low pressure. That seems to work pretty well. So I've got my Iwata Neo 0.35 millimeter needle at 15 psi, and I'm going to just dump a little bit of this in there. Doesn't take much, and as you can see, I've marked each section of the test piece according to what type of chipping fluid I'm going to use. And this section right here is for the heavy chipping effects. So here we go. What I'm going to be doing with all of these, because again, this is what seems to work well for me, and I want to use the number of layers as a control. So I'm going to be going for 2 even layers of material. Okay, we'll let that layer dry for a minute. I can already tell that choosing white might not have been the best choice because it's pretty difficult to see the chipping fluid on there, but maybe at an angle there you can kind of see what I've got going on there. I should also have told you that the white paint that's on here is just Stynylrez white primer. The only reason I picked that was because Stynylrez is my go-to acrylic primer, and I picked white because I don't use it very often and I've got plenty to spare. So that's the only reason there. Plus it'll show up well as the chipped color. So you can see that that's pretty wet there, but what you can do is you can use the airbrush to dry it off pretty quickly if that's what you want to do. So I'm just going to dry that off. This stuff goes on fast because it is so thin. Okay, so that immediately is pretty dry. And I'm going to go ahead and apply a second layer. And I'm going in the opposite or 90-degree direction this time, just to make sure I get good coverage. So there it is, and hopefully you can see that. It looks pretty, I don't know what the right word is, looks pretty splattery. It's not a nice, even, flat coat. I'm not worried about that, but that's obviously going to have an effect, maybe, on the way that it performs. So there we go. That's the first one. Heavy chipping effects. And I'm going to go ahead and dump that out and just all I'm going to do is give the airbrush a quick rinse and then switch over to the next one. Okay, now all I've done is rinse the airbrush out with one pass of my normal cleaner for acrylic paints, and that should be plenty because this stuff is, it's hairspray. So now, since I've got the bottle sitting right here, I'm going to go ahead and switch to the number 3 hold hairspray, which is what I've been using extensively. And we'll spray that right here on the end panel. And you can see that even after the minute or so that it took me to prepare for this part of the test, that the heavy chipping effects there's still areas of it that aren't quite dry. So here we go. Okay, so there we go. That's one layer of that stuff with that nice, lovely smell of hairspray that reminds me of all my high school girlfriends back in the 80s. I'm going to dry that off a little bit so I can go ahead and get the next layer down. And you can see this stuff dries pretty quick. Okay, so I think I got my coverage pretty even there. What you're kind of looking for with these, and this is something that Rinaldi also talks about, but I don't know if you'll be able to see it, is when you've got a light sheen, okay, then you've probably got enough on there. I don't know if you'll be able to tell with this white paint, but if you look between these two panels that have it versus the one that doesn't, that there is a little bit of a sheen there. So that's a good way to gauge, and it's much easier to see on darker colors, but that's a good way to gauge when you've got the right amount of stuff on there. So now that I've got that one done, I'm going to go ahead and switch over to one of the other materials and just go ahead and bust through this. Okay, so the next one I'm going to do is Scratch's Effects. Okay, so I've got 2 layers of Scratches Effects on there. You saw that I was air drying it in between, and you can see that it is pretty wet. One thing I've definitely noticed that's different between the MIG chipping fluids and the hairspray is that the hairspray dries a lot quicker. Why that is, I have no idea, but it's just a difference that I've noticed. Whether or not it has any effect on the finished product is, remains to be seen. Now, one thing that I also will say about this, no matter which of these materials you're using, if you get uneven areas where it's thicker in some places than others, don't worry about that unless you are targeting a specific effect in a specific place, because that randomness of the thickness of the coat of chipping fluid is going to contribute to the randomness of the final effect, which is really what this is all about. So just let her rip and let it turn out however it turns out. Okay, now I've got the extra hold hairspray, the HS4, in this little cup that I decanted it into, and we'll go ahead now and apply that. Okay, now that is not coming out of the airbrush quite as fast, and that's why I kind of went back over that first layer, because I couldn't see that I was really getting much on there. And that may be because it's thicker, I don't know. But I'm going to go ahead and hit that one more time. Okay. And now you can kind of see that light sheen that I'm talking about. And hopefully you've noticed with both of these materials, both of these hairspray materials, that they lay down much differently than the chipping fluids out of the bottle do. These, to me, behave more like paint. I have found that it's easier to get an even coat of uniform thickness with the hairspray than with the other stuff. Now again, that's going to affect the finished product, but it remains to be seen exactly what that effect is. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and rinse out this airbrush, and then we're going to get right to applying some paint. So the amount of time that the hairspray has to dry is another variable in the process, although I've kind of concluded that it may not make a whole lot of difference. The bottom line for me is that there's no reason to wait, really, and so what I try to do is, as soon as I know the chipping fluid is dry and I'm all prepared for paint, I just get right into it, and that seems to be working pretty well. So let me get this airbrush clean, and we'll get right to the next step. Okay, now this is the moment where we talk about the next 2 variables that you run into with the chipping process. And that is what paint you choose and what you thin it with. Now, as far as paint goes, the reason that I'm using Tamiya, and in this case, in particular, sea blue. I'm using the sea blue because it's a dark color and I have plenty of it and don't have any need for it anytime soon. But I'm using Tamiya for 2 reasons. One, because it's become my preferred exterior paint, and so I want my process to be dialed in for that. The second reason is because lots of people seem to agree that Tamiya chips pretty well. And this is a kind of a point to talk briefly about paint chemistry, because that's what affects the way that a paint chips. The way that the process basically works is that the water that you use on your brush when you actually do the chipping has to be able to permeate through the paint layer and liquefy the dried hairspray in order to allow it to release from the surface. So what it really all comes down to is the permeability of the paint layer, and different types of paint are going to produce a different type of skin. Tamiya seems to produce a good compromise between porosity and strength. If you use one of the water-based acrylics like Vallejo, Model Master Acryl, Life Color, some of those that have a higher vinyl content in their mixture, what you find is that they produce a kind of a skin that is almost impermeable to water. Model Master Acryl in particular, I've had terrible luck trying to chip it. I mean, just think about waterproof latex paint that you use in your kitchen. That's a pretty close cousin of what's in those bottles that we call model paint. And it's waterproof for a reason. So it doesn't work so well. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got lacquers and enamels. Now, those materials create a much harder, tougher shell. And so it's automatically going to be more difficult for the water to permeate through that and activate whatever chipping fluid you use. So that's why I'm choosing to use Tamiya. Now, the thinner is also very important. And you might say, well, why does it matter what you thin it with? Well, the thinner is going to have a lot to do with how tough the ultimate paint shell is going to be. As you know, you can thin Tamiya with everything from cat piss to jet fuel. And if you thin it with lacquer thinner, like Tamiya lacquer thinner or Mr. Leveling thinner, you're going to get a paint shell that's much more like a true lacquer. It's going to be a lot tougher. On the other end of the spectrum, if you thin it with pure tap water, which is something that Rinaldi is a big fan of, you get a paint that's relatively weak and relatively porous and is going to chip quite easily. I choose to use an alcohol-based thinner. In this particular case, UMP's airbrush thinner, which I have used for a long time and I like a lot because it works well with every kind of paint that I've ever tried it with. I have some Tamiya X20A sitting right over there, and it would probably work fine, but this stuff is also one of my favorites for another reason, and that is that I'm a drop counter. I like the dropper on the end of this because it enables me to get my ratios pretty consistent. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a couple of mils of this Tamiya Sea Blue, and I'm going to thin it 50-50 with the UMP thinner. So there's 1.5 mils and another 0.5 mil there. And so I don't so much have to count drops this time around because I'm using enough paint that I can just measure it in my little cup here. But it is kind of handy to know that and I've kind of measured this out one day. It takes about 35 drops to make a mil. But I've got 2.5 mils of paint in here right now, so I'm going to just add enough thinner to get us up to 5. There we go. That's one of the great things about these little measuring cups. And I'm going to go ahead and get that stirred up, and then we're going to move back over to the paint booth and start laying this down. Okay, there's not going to be a whole lot to talk about while I'm doing this because I'm basically just going to be painting. But there are a couple of important points because we're now up to the next variable in this process, and that is how thick we lay the paint on. And that definitely is one of the most important variables because, as you can imagine, the thicker the layer of paint, the more difficult it is for the water to permeate and activate the chipping fluid. So where that really comes into play is painting strategically according to the ultimate effect that you want. If you know that you want a lot of paint to come off when you do your chipping, then it's a good idea to paint thinner. If you want more discrete scratches and chips, then you might paint a little bit thicker. So again, you just have to be kind of forward thinking at this point in the process. And what I'm going to try to do is paint part of these areas in a uniform thickness and then in another area in a lighter thickness. So we'll get a couple of different weights going on there. Now, back to the thinning ratio that I used. I thinned this at 50-50, not because I'm telling you that's what you need to do, but because that's kind of my preferred base ratio for this material. You might want it thinner than that, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, and that's totally cool. What you have to do is figure out how that affects the alchemy of the chipping process and, adjust accordingly. So here we go. I'm going to just paint this pretty much like I normally would. Okay, so one thing to notice here, I'm just going to stick my finger on here and pick this up. Look closely at this area right here. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. See right there on the right where there's actually a little bit of cracking showing already? That's where the paint is going down wet enough that it's already kind of activating the chipping fluid. So that's just something to be aware of as you're laying down your paint, to just be cautious and not go too wet right off the bat. You definitely want to build up in light layers. Okay, so I'm going to stop right there, and hopefully you can see what I was doing is I've kind of created a full opacity section here on the back part of the wing, a medium opacity section, and then a real lightweight one here. So not only can we still see which area is which, but we'll be able to kind of see how the chipping behaves differently according to how thick the color coat actually is. I also didn't try to do any sort of marbling or any kind of shading techniques because that's not really what we're about right now. Okay, so I went and had a little bit of lunch, and here we are about 45 minutes after this stuff got sprayed, and we're ready to actually do some chipping. So that gets into the next variable in this process, and that is the amount of time that you wait before you actually get started. Now, when I initially started this, I was waiting for anywhere as little as 15 minutes up to half an hour, and I definitely learned that you can go too soon, because if the paint isn't solid enough, it'll basically just turn into mush as opposed to coming off in chips, which is obviously not a good thing. I also believed that you could wait too long, and that was based on some experiences that I had with the regular MIG chipping fluids, and I interpreted the difficulties that I was having as the fact that I had waited longer than I should have. Now, what I've discovered with hairspray, and Rinaldi verifies this quite a bit, is that you have maybe not an unlimited amount of time, but you've at least got 24 to 48 hours. And I've confirmed that for myself in doing some chipping that started the day before, and things went just fine. Okay, so now the next variable after that we're going to get into is what tools do we use? And this is huge, because how the implement of choice impacts the surface has everything to do with the way that paint comes off. So I don't believe that there is a right tool, and I'm not going to try to tell you that the tools I use are the best. What I've done is just basically work until I've come up with a set of tools that does what I want them to do on a consistent basis. And I'll sort of explain that. I've got a large, fairly soft, cheap synthetic brush, and it's not super soft. It's not as soft as a real hair brush would be. It's definitely got some spring to it, and that's a huge factor. That amount of spring really plays an important part. I've got a smaller one that is also just a cheap synthetic brush, but it's a little softer for whatever reason. And then I've got a brush that I've trimmed down to where it's kind of medium length bristles there. And again, just a cheap synthetic brush. And then I've got this thing, which is just a junky flexi-file brush, and that I've trimmed down to where it's basically nothing more than stubble. And you'll see here pretty directly that each of these things does something different. Now, there's also a whole other set of tools that you could use for making scratches. Some people recommend toothpicks, knife points, things like that. I've had terrible luck with toothpicks, and I'm going to try right here for you today something that Rinaldi recommends as well, which is this Tamiya stir stick. And we'll see how that works. But that involves a different sort of technique because you have to pre-wet the surface. Obviously, this does not hold any water. So that gets into the next variable, which is the amount of water that you use. And I've got just a little dish with some water in it right here. And so what I'm going to do is go at this in the way that's developed for me over the last few weeks and has kind of proven to work pretty well for me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this brush right here, and I'm going to go after this area that's HS3, which is the same hairspray that I've been using, and that's going to be kind of my baseline. Now I will also tell you that while I'm doing this, I am wearing my Optivisor. The reason that I'm wearing my Optivisor is, actually there's two reasons. One is because, as Rinaldi says, and I know I keep referring to him, but I'm not really a fanboy, it's just that he is the guru of chipping. And one of the things that he says is you can never have a chip that's too small. And when you think about the scale that we're working on, that is exactly true. So I want to be able to see the tiniest chips. The second thing is, and this gets into the next variable, we're getting quite a stack of variables here, is the amount of time that you continue to work after you see the first chip appear, because that's critical. The thing that happens with this process is that you can be, just working along, making brush strokes, and things can literally change dramatically from stroke number 9 to stroke number 10. Whereas 1 second you didn't have hardly any paint coming off, the next second it's flying off like an atmospheric re-entry. So you really need to be able to see what's going on so that you can make that spur of the moment judgment about what you're going to do next. So if your vision's good enough that you don't need it, then that's great, good for you. But I have to work with my Optivisor, so if that hasn't occurred to you, definitely consider it. Okay, so here we go. Now, what I'm going to do is, you can see, now we're getting into the next variable, and that is the amount of water. Now, when I started doing this, I was pre-wetting. I was brushing on a bunch of water and letting it sit there and then just going to work. And every time I looked at it, I was frustrated because my chips were huge. I couldn't get small, subtle effects. And so what I've finally settled on is a process where after I dip the brush in the water, then what I do is I immediately remove a large part of that moisture before I go to work. And that enables me to start kind of sneaking up on things. And you can see that even with that amount of moisture, immediately I've got some large chunks of paint coming off there. Now, this paint right here is fairly thin, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop working in that area and immediately move someplace else. You can see, again, this is sort of the medium thick place where I'm working here. You can see that paint is coming off easy. probably easier than I want it to. And you can see when I go back to that area where it initially came off, that it does continue to come off very easily. So that's what I mean when I say you've got to be very aware of what's happening, and as soon as you see that paint starting to move, then you've got to go on to a new area and let that dry. Otherwise, it's just going to be uncontrollable. So again, I've got this brush where it's barely wet, and I'm using very light strokes. And you can see that, hopefully you can see that I can get tiny little chips, and if I move on, they stay tiny. But if I stay working in that same area, they get big in a hurry. So you really have to have a delicate touch. That's probably one of the most important things that I've learned. So again, you can see by just using a sort of a tapping motion what I can achieve. Now, that's the next variable, is what type of motion do you use? When I first started doing it, I was copying what I saw other people doing in videos, and I was just brushing the surface. And that works, but again, it produces a certain type of effect that can get away from you in a hurry. Now, I will say this is coming off of here easier than I expected it to. Why that is, I don't know. But look, this is the bottom line, is you have to just work with whatever is happening when it's happening. If it's not happening exactly the way that you expected it to, don't get hung up on that. Just adjust your techniques accordingly, and everything will be fine. The other thing to always keep in mind is that you can always spray on more paint or more chipping fluid and more paint and keep repeating the process. So back to brush motion, okay? You can brush in strokes, you can tap, you can scrub. Obviously, if you take a tool like this flat-ended thing that I've got here and put a little bit of water on it and start scrubbing, paint's going to come off differently than it does if you are using brush strokes. Now, what I think you're seeing here, I expected it to come off easier right there in that area than it did over here because of the brush I'm using being more aggressive. Sorry, I keep bumping into the camera, but it actually did not come off quite as easy, and the effect was a little bit more subtle. And that's got everything to do with how much chipping fluid there is in that area. The basic rule of thumb is that the more chipping fluid you've got, the easier the paint is going to come off. So again, just another one of the many variables in the process that you've got to work with. So you can see what I mean, I think, when I say that it's alchemy, and how every one of these variables is going to affect the result. So let's take a closer look at what I've done so far. Okay, you can kind of see there what sort of chips we've got. Okay, let's move over to the area here that has the thickest paint of all. And let's see, let me go back. What I usually do is I start with the least aggressive brush and work my way up from there. But the brush design, while it may be soft, also may actually end up being more aggressive because it holds more water. And the amount of water that's in play is hugely important. I know I keep saying that, but it's probably been one of my number one learnings in doing this. Now, hopefully you can see what's happening here. Paint's coming off, but obviously not as easily as it was in the other section there, because this paint is quite a bit thicker. Now, but again, once it starts, you can see what happens. If you keep working, then you can just end up with a mess very quickly. So this is really a strategy of sneaking up on it, and especially if you're trying to create a pattern of a specific shape, like you might have around a hatch, or on a wing walk right next to the cockpit, or something of that nature. So, all right, let's move over now to the hairspray with extra hold and see how things go there, and if we can even tell a difference. So I'm going to just immediately start in on this area where the paint is the thickest and just go at it. And one thing I like about the brush stroke method is that when you get it down and you're using paint that's fairly resistant, and you've got a small amount of water, you can really create subtle effects with small chips, because there's more of an effect of wearing through the paint rather than just knocking it off. But again, you can see it totally depends on the way that you attack it. Now, I'm going to switch again over to this brush. I honestly, at this point, just from what little bit I've done here, I can't say that I can tell much of a difference in the way the paint's coming off between the two different types of hairspray. It seems to be honestly behaving about the same. I guess I probably would have predicted that it would be easier with the hairspray extra hold, which seems kind of backwards, but I think why I would have said that is because I think the extra spray or extra hold hairspray creates a thicker layer, which, going back to that thing I was saying about how the more hairspray you've got, or chipping fluid of whatever kind, the easier the paint comes off. So you can see what I've done here is I've switched to this aggressive, nasty little thing, and I'm trying to just create a little bit of a pattern right here around this object, whatever it is, and just see what I can achieve. Again, it's all about the amount of water and the technique. You can really just immediately start ripping paint off, or you can go at it more subtly. I have really tried to develop a technique that lets me sneak up on it, because it's a lot easier to add more chips than it is to come back and add more paint. Now what I'm trying to do here is create a sort of a graduated effect. Chipping is what I would call a diffuse effect, where you're going to have the most wear in the center of the pattern, and then further out you're going to have more scattered effects. So that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. Now, hopefully I'm capturing this. I just realized that the camera might be focusing more on my hand than it is on the workpiece here. So anyway, hopefully that's not the case and it's coming out good and you guys can see what's going on. But I won't know until I go back and have a look later. So you can see what I'm doing here is trying to create some smaller chips out around the edges of this area so that it sort of diffuses. Now, and this is where, again, you can see what I'm saying about how important it is to just immediately move on as soon as you start to see that paint moving, no matter how much you want to keep going. Like I want to do a little work on this chunk right here by my fingernail, but it's super wet right now, and I know that if I touch it at all, it's going to come flying off there. So it's a good idea not to mess with that. So what we'll do instead is we'll shift over here to the next patch, which is going to be the heavy chipping effects, which in theory should have paint coming off of there pretty quickly because that's what heavy chipping effects are and what it's allegedly designed to do. So let's see what we get. So this is kind of interesting. Rather than coming off in kind of large areas like it was over next door, even when I kind of keep going at it, it's coming off in little chunks, really little chunks, which is nice because that's what you want. And I have to say that that's not necessarily what I expected to see. Let's see what happens when I go back to this brush and we start working it that way. Let's see what happens. See, that method, it starts to come off pretty quickly, just like it does with the hairspray. So again, you can see the difference in technique really makes a huge difference in the way that it turns out. So again, I'm a little surprised. I haven't used this heavy chipping effects fluid in a long time, since back when I very first did my first attempt at chipping. I only used it once. It seemed like it did not work all that well for me, but I was using Model Master Acryl paint at the time, which I had just learned through trial and error was terrible paint to use for chipping because I just could never seem to get the chipping fluid to work. And over time, I learned why. It just the stuff just makes too much of a skin and doesn't want to come off. So there we go. You can kind of see the difference there. I would say at this point that it was a bit more difficult to get the paint moving on this heavy chipping effects than it was on either of these two hairspray patches, which would not have been my prediction. So now let's see what happens when we skip over here to the scratches effects. And I'm going to just stick to the same brush and just keep working. Now, immediately, I have happening what has frustrated me about scratches effects. And this is a perfect illustration of why this process can be so annoying. Scratches effects is supposed to be more subtle, right? It's supposed to be scratches and wear as opposed to chunks of paint flying off like that. But even though I was using a very similar technique to what I was using in these other places, I've got chunks of paint flying off. That is definitely not any sort of subtle right there. And, you know, you guys saw me spraying the material on there, and obviously there's no guarantee that I did it exactly the same in each area, but you're never going to. You just kind of have to deal with that. So I think that this is valuable because what I'm probably already concluding from this test is that as much as people have preferred chipping fluids, that technique probably makes more difference at the end of the day than which chipping fluid you pick. You may find for your technique that hairspray is the best. That's certainly where I've been leaning. Somebody else may find that for the results that they're after, that something else works the best. I would venture to guess that if I put a piece of tape over each one of these labels and showed this to somebody as a blind test and said, tell me which of these areas is which type of chipping fluid, that they wouldn't be able to get hardly any of them right. Whichever ones they got right would be purely a matter of luck. Because, again, just looking at those results, I don't think that they necessarily go along with what you'd expect based on the what we know about each one of those fluids. This also shows, I think, that a lot of how it turns out depends on the way that the material lays down. If you remember, with both of these hairspray materials, we got a nice, even, flat layer. Whereas over here with the bottled chipping fluids, the effect was more uneven. And why that is, who knows? What's in that material that causes it to behave that way, I don't know. But the bottom line is that this is very much an adjust on the fly as a result of what your situational awareness tells you kind of process. You can see that I came back and worked on that one area a little bit more and made it a little bit more faded out, and what kind of a difference that makes. Now, here is another thing that some people find is that you get a a certain amount of residue left. And let me show you up close what I'm talking about. Like right here in the middle of that chip. See, there's basically just a sort of film of dissolved paint. Now, that may be okay with you, depending again on what you're trying to achieve, or you may want to remove that. And what I've found that works good for that is a Q-tip, and I don't want a lot of moisture on this Q-tip for doing this. So I might just lick it a little bit on the end, and then just use it to very carefully wipe away that bit of film. What you may also find is that if you put some moisture in that Q-tip, remove most of it, you may find, as I have, that becomes another kind of chipping tool, and that you may like the effect that produces. Basically, anything that holds water is a potential candidate for this process. Now, let's try something else here. Let's try some actual scratches using this Tamiya stir stick, and let's see what sort of luck we have. Now, when you do that, what you need to do is take and pre-wet the area that you're going to work on. So we'll just do this area right here. And so what you want to do is put some water there, but don't do any action. Then take your instrument and go at it, and you can see now you are creating a very different type of effect, and it can get out of hand in a big hurry. Just, all I'm doing here is using the corner of the thing and just very lightly tapping in that area. And that's great because you can create some really, really tiny effects. It's slow, but that's okay. I mean, this is definitely one of those things where, in my opinion, you shouldn't be in any kind of hurry. It takes however long it takes. And rushing is just a good way to not get good results. So there we go. That's not too bad. That works nicely to create a kind of a diffuse effect. And obviously you're going to be able to control that very well. Like let's skip over here to the area that's got the regular heavy chipping effects, and let's use the pointed tool or the metal tool to create wear and tear along this specific boundary right here. So got some water on there, and now let's start working that along the edge. So what you want to do is try and think as you're working how this actually gets worn in real life. There's more action toward the edge, and then it may taper off as you go along the edge, because all the activity is concentrated. In a particular location. Now, the thing that you've got to be careful of with using a tool like this is that it can be, you can find yourself creating a lot of very similar marks because the motion of your hand is basically the same and the orientation of the tool in your hand stays the same. So just try and change it up as much as you can while you're working so that you don't get repetition, because that's the thing that kills chipping. It's by its very nature in real life, it's a random process. It may happen within a pattern like this, but within that pattern, it's basically chaos. There's no predicting where a chunk of a certain size or shape is going to come off. So what you have to do is resist the human brain's urge to form patterns, because that's what's really going to stick out like a sore thumb in the finished product. If you're not careful, is it'll end up looking manufactured, and that's the last thing that you want. And also, every so often, just kind of step back and take a look at that and think, okay, from a purely artistic standpoint, does that look the way that I want it to? Is it attractive? Is it interesting? And does it diffuse over the area that I'm dealing with in a natural way? Or is it just really abrupt? Because that's not what you want. So there we go. I adjusted that a little bit so it's got a real heavy bit of wear in kind of the middle that sort of diffuses out towards the edges. Now here's another trick. Let's say that you want to create a scratch that might happen on the side of a vehicle as it's traveling through the forest. You know, it rubs up against a tree trunk or something, and you know, gets a bunch of paint scratched off. So what you do is you apply water to the area that you want to work on, and then you get your tool here and you just use something as a guide so that you get a straight line. Now, I'm not necessarily doing a great job of it, but you get the idea. Okay, so just make the line make the line straight. Start with a straight line like that, and then you can come back if you want to with one of your brushes and continue to work on that shape and give it even more character. Say that the paint just really got shredded along the way. You know, you can see that there's an endless possibilities for how you can create different shapes and patterns of scratches. But the main thing to always be thinking about is keeping your effects in scale. And that's where that thing of never being able to have a chip that's too small really comes into play. And I think that that's what makes the difference between a really good chipping job and one that's not as good, is like like I was saying before, is just being able to achieve that subtle level of control, because the human brain interprets things in a certain way, and if it doesn't look natural, then it's an immediate alarm bell. So there we go. I think that's about as much of a demonstration and a test as we can really probably justify at this point. Okay, decided to try and do one more thing, just kind of to see if I could do it. I want to illustrate how quickly things can change with this process, and why you've really got to be prepared to stop. So I've got this brush. There it is. I'm going to try and actually do this on camera. I think I can get zoomed in here close enough to where maybe I can do this. So I've got most of the moisture removed from this brush. So I'm going to attempt to just work right here in this area. And you can see, man, trying to look at this through the screen while I'm doing it really screws with my depth perception. So I'm working here in just this area. You can see there's, okay, now you see that chip appeared right there. Now I'll keep moving around. See, now I'm getting some tiny little chips, and those are pretty good. So you can see they just barely start to appear. But look, as soon as I keep going, it's like literally the next stroke takes a big chunk of paint out. And if I come back, look how things just go completely south. No more control. So again, this is just going back to that thing of really controlling your technique. And I guess kind of just going back to that no chip too small is, as much as you want to take one more stroke at a particular area, you really have to resist the urge to do that if you want to create a gradual pattern, something like this, or like this, where you get fade out at each end of it, which is how a lot of chipping patterns look. So, okay, that's enough of that. Okay, so there we go. That was maybe a pretty exhaustive or just exhausting look at the chipping process. I think this was a worthwhile exercise, though. I don't know about you guys, but I learned something. I have progressed through various chipping fluids and adjustments to my technique over the last few months, and this is the first time I've tried to do something sort of as a side-by-side comparison. And quite honestly, I didn't learn what I expected to learn. I have really had the best luck in my projects with hairspray, and I expected to see that reflected here with this experiment. It's basically just proven to be more controllable. And actually, it almost seems like, from what I did here, that the thing I expected to be the least controllable, which was the heavy chipping effects fluid for MIG, was almost the most controllable. But I think that you could see by the way that I was doing it and the results I was getting, what I was saying, that the the technique and the combination of variables really matters a lot more than the specific materials involved, whether that's the specific paint, the specific thinner, and most especially the specific chipping fluid. Um, I'm probably going to continue to use hairspray. The thing about this is that I've found is that to a certain extent, you're going to almost feel every time you do it like you're starting over, at least for a while. And that's okay, as long as you ultimately get back to the same place of control and results that you're after, and maybe it takes less and less time and frustration each go round. And so, one caveat or one warning I would definitely issue is to always start your chipping in an area where it's not so important, and start slowly, start carefully, and definitely sneak up on it, and things should be okay. And especially if you're working, I'm mostly an aircraft guy, but especially if you're working on something that's just really beat to hell. Um, there's no limit to the number of times that you can redo and do this, especially if you're just doing, after creating tonal variety by, let's say that the colors you're chipping are basically just lighter and darker versions of the base color, which is a great technique for things like tires, for example. If it doesn't turn out exactly the way that you want it to the first time, that's cool. Just let everything dry, spray on some more chipping fluid, spray on some more paint, and go after it again. The idea is not so much that there's a right result, but that there's a natural looking result. So hopefully, if chipping is something that you're interested in doing on your projects, this has been helpful. And as always, I hope that you found it informative and maybe a little entertaining. I don't know how that's possible with a video like this, but at any rate, I appreciate you guys hanging tough with me through the whole thing and watching what I had to say about it. Appreciate it. Much love.